Magic the Gathering's a pretty amazing game. We may complain about a lot of decisions that come from the mothership, but all things considered, the game itself is very solid. And one of the most unique parts about Magic the Gathering is the resource system that we have. The mana in this game is unlike what exists in most other games. Pokemon's energy system is simplistic by comparison. Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a resource system by any real measurable note. Hearthstone's mana system is automatically done for you, much like any other resource system in multiple other games. Magic the Gathering, on the other hand, presents a puzzle for you to solve with its mana system. Unfortunately, I have seen a lot of players get very frustrated with this puzzle. There's a lot of aspects about lands that players do not like, and I guess I'm just going to go ahead and clear some of that up for you. I've previously done land guides on how to just make various mana bases work. Here's the lands that I think are most important in decks, how to do deck construction, but maybe it's time that I sit down and do a deep dive into various different types of mana bases that you would use in decks. So today, I'm going to show you how for about $20, build a 5-color mana base, as well as a tricolor mana base, a 2-color mana base, and even a robust monocolor mana base. And yes, it's going to be far more interesting than you think when it comes to that final one. So let's go ahead and strap in. It's time to talk about mana. Now, the first thing to talk about when we're talking about mana bases is what makes a good mana base. And in my experience, there are a couple criteria. One, most of your lands need to come into play untapped with very few exceptions. This allows you to play on curve with the other people at the table. And two, you need to make sure that you can hit all the colors in a reasonable amount of time. This is sometimes very difficult for a lot of players to do depending on what their mana base is trying to accomplish. Also, a good mana base for any color combination should have at least 1 or 2 utility lands so that you have some double duty in cardboard slots you were already dedicating to other cards. In 1, 2, and 3 color decks, this can take the place of MDFCs that have utility on multiple sides. In monocolor decks, this will take the place of multiple basic utility lands. And in a 5-color deck, there's really only a few utility lands you can fit in, but I think one you should always consider, in my opinion, is Pit of Offerings. This will exile 3 cards from anybody's graveyards and will allow you to tap for the color combination of any of those cards. You only get 1 mana, but if you get rid of an Izzet card, a green card, and then an Orzhov card, suddenly you've got WUBRG mana in this land, and you also got rid of a bunch of important reanimation pieces as well. Another thing to note, if you are playing a WUBRG deck, there is 0 reason not to include Murmuring Bosk. This is effectively a triome that will give you access to 3/5 of your colors in any given deck. The reason why I think this is important is because it is fetchable. Fetchable lands are very hard to come by on a budget, or at least they used to be, so making sure that you've got the ability to grab this with a Wood Elves, a Nature's Lore, or a 3 Visits is super important. It is a forest in the deck, and it will count for 3/5 of the colors you need to complete a WUBRG deck. You should also have the 5 Tango lands if you need easy access searchables. These are all come into play untapped lands if you have 2 basic lands, and I'll get into how to get those basic lands on the board here in a minute. But they each tap for 2 colors, and they are searchable in your deck because they have land types. This means I can use a Wood Elves to get Cinderglade, I can use a Corrosion Verge to get a Canopy Vista and a Prairie Stream, or a Murmuring Bosk, really. I can use a Farseek to get a Sunken Hollow or a Smoldering Marsh. These lands are so important because they are super budget friendly. Everybody's got a billion of them. They will literally hand them to you because it is considered worthless cardboard to most players, but they are super important for building budget decks. But if you're building a budget mana base, then you need to have the other half of your lands covered. These only cover the allied colors in Magic, which are, of course, the colors located next to each other on the color pie on the back of every Magic card. What about the enemy colors? Well, luckily, recently Wizards of the Coast did print out a bunch of filter lands that complete the old Odyssey cycle of filter lands. These cover our Boros, Simic, Izzet, Golgari, and Orzhov colors, and with these, these, we have very easy access to colored mana that benefits another land type we're going to be talking about. A lot of people don't like these lands. A lot of people are wrong. You filter one land or one mana of any color into it to get 2 colors out of it. This means that it's very easy to hit our needs for colors late in the game, especially when, like I said, we'll talk about a different kind of land that pairs super well with these. Well, actually, we'll talk about one of those types right now. These are the pain lands. They don't work as well with the filter lands as I am leading on. There's a better land for this, but these are so cheap these days at $3, $1, 77 cents. Like, none of these break the bank at all. In fact, this entire mana base is $21, and it accounts for 46 lands, meaning you can shave off whatever lands don't apply to you in your Wooburg deck or your 4-color deck. Either of those mana bases can be shaped with this guide. Just take out the stuff that doesn't apply to your color combination or that you're not leaning into, and suddenly you will have an almost perfectly sculpted mana base. Anyway, these tap for colorless mana, or they tap for whichever colors they list on the card by dealing a damage to you. You should be running all of these if you are running a budget Wooburg deck, because you can choose to only use the colors you need when you need them and focus heavily on the colorless for whatever costs are in your 7 cost spells later in the game. They will not hurt you. Before I get into some of the other more interesting cards in a 5-color mana base, though, I just need to nod Exotic Orchard and Command Tower are auto-includes in every single one of these decks. Again, like with the other cards I've talked about, people probably have a shit ton of these in droves. They will just hand these to you if they have extras of them. It won't hurt. They'll also do it with the Tango lands, I promise you. As far as fetching lands, there are 12 cards I would run in damn near every 5-color deck. Every single one of these has maximum utility because they do a lot of jobs for us. Starting with an obvious one from a lot of budget decks, Ash Barrens. This comes down and gives us colorless mana if we need it, or we can basic land cycle it to grab one of our basic lands out of our deck. But the most important part about our deck is not the Ash Barrens. I just think that's a really good card everybody should use. You should also always have access to a Crow's Verge if you are in 5 colors. If you've got things like the Murmuring Bosk and the Tango lands, this is a land that not only will ramp you for the low price of being a tapped land early, but also it can grab you all of your color combinations right out of the deck. You will have 4 colors available when you use Crow's Verge. Use it to grab Prairie Stream and Murmuring Bosk, and now the only color land you are missing is red. Though, of course, you can find ways of getting that as well. Use it to grab a Cinderglade in a Canopy Vista if you've already got access to your other land types. Crow's Verge can get you basically anything that you are missing whenever you are missing it in a 5-color deck, because it can grab a forest and a plains. Any forest and any plains, not just basic ones. But the breadth of our deck, the thing that makes 5-color mana bases so easy to construct these days, are the landscapes. Each and every one of these serves the exact same purpose. They can come down and tap for colorless mana whenever we need them to, which pairs perfectly with our filter lands. We can use that colorless mana and our filter lands to just effectively say, oh, yeah, I don't need to tap this Shattered Landscape to get a basic land. I'm just going to use it to filter into my Desolate Mire. So now I've got an Orzhov color combination always on the board. This means this will be no different than having just a Plains and a Swamp on the board for most purposes. Each and every one of these has 3 modes. Come into play untapped and give colorless mana. Excellent. Tap it to grab one of 3 basic lands out of your deck. That's 3/5 of an Evolving Wilds while being mana otherwise is amazing. Or if it's late in the game and we don't need the mana for anything, we can cycle these to grab any type of card out of our deck that we need. If you're drawing cards out of your deck, the options are endless. And like I said, this is a base that consists of 46 cards. So what makes up the rest of our cards? Well, 2 of every basic land. If you're going to be running the panoramas, then you need to make sure your deck is chock full of enough basic lands to warrant them. And because the panoramas can come down as colorless mana later in the game, we only really need 10 basic lands to grab. So With these and everything else, we have a 46 land mana base. If you're playing a 4-color deck, get rid of whichever colors don't apply to you, and you should be left with a 37 land mana base. Same with playing a WUBRG deck that leans into more 2 or 3 color strategies, which you should be doing anyway if you're playing WUBRG, because it makes the deck function way better. This should shave you down to a smaller mana base of about 37, 38 cards. This gives you, without having to play a Gates deck, basically a perfectly sculpted WUBRG deck. But what if you wanted to play a tricolor deck instead? Well, let's get into that. For my 3-color deck example, we are going to be using Abzan. This is because an Abzan, or a black-white-green deck, has access to a super unique card that I want to make sure I make mention of before I go on to the other deck types. And this is, of course, Murmuring Bosk. I already talked about it when I talked about WUBRG decks, but if you're running an Abzan deck, you should be running this. It is a fetchable triome in your colors. Super, super simple. Another thing of note, if you are playing any 3-color deck that happens to have black as one of its colors, then you should be trying out the Tainted lands as well. These come into play untapped and give mana no matter what, and if you've got a swamp, they will tap for 2 types of mana for you. This is incredibly helpful because all of the access to untapped lands we have is important, especially because it makes up for things like Murmuring Bosk being a tapped land otherwise. Past that, this is going to be a 37, and every other deck type I talk about is going to be a 37 land base, which is about how much you should be running in most of your decks, with few exceptions, unless you are running that like cut a land problem that everyone seems to run into. That said, the next thing that saves our bacon on price is the Pain lands. 3 Pain lands for this deck ran us a grand total of $3.50. For about 20 cents, we were able to put in both of the Omni lands that are included in just about every single precon, and then we've also got the Flip lands. A good chunk of the budget for this got thrown into Flip lands. About $7 of our budget, $8 actually of our budget, goes into Flip lands. Branchloft Pathway, Bright Climb Pathway, and Darkboar Pathway. Though, of course, depending on your color combinations, you may spend less money than that. Darkboar Pathway just happens to be uniquely expensive. Once again, filter lands come in clutch, being anywhere between 9 cents and 70 cents, giving us access to mana on the cheap. For our fetching lands, things look a little bit different. If we are running a 3-color deck, then I suggest running, of course, your landscape. In Abzan's case, Corrosion Verge always does very good work, but you also should be supplementing those landscapes with Promising Vein and Shire Terrace. Both of these are effectively panoramas, and if you're running a color combination with an actual panorama, then put one of those in too. But these come into play untapped and can be used to get whatever color you are missing out of your deck. I like these more than Ash Barrens in 3-color decks because these can come down on their own and then at a later date be used to grab you a different land or provide you a deck shuffle or anything like that. Whereas Ash Barrens, I don't like in 3-color decks as much because we don't necessarily need that card to drop on the board and only sit down as a colorless land, as it won't benefit a myriad of filter lands the same way it does in the WUBRG deck. Also, it's important to have fetchable lands in your deck, so for us we're running 3 fetchable lands: Canopy Vista, Haunted Mire, and Snowfield Sinkhole. Anytime your deck's color combination allows you to have access to a Tango land, then you take it. Naya, of course, gets 2 of them in the case of Canopy Vista and Cinderglade, but for our purposes, we only get access to 1. So, whatever's cheapest for you, the second best thing you can do is grab the Dominaria United tapped duels or the Kaldheim Snow duels. These come into play tapped, which sucks for us, but they are searchable, which means we can grab Haunted Mire with Wood Elves, and we can grab Snowfield Sinkhole with Core Cartographer. We can also grab either of these with Corrosion Verge, which completely negates the side effects of them being tapped lands, as any land that comes into play with Corrosion Verge is a tapped land anywho. Next, we have 3 check lands: Isolated Chapel, Sunpetal Grove, and Woodland Cemetery. If you need to know which lands are check lands, just go to my lands guide. I'll have it linked down below, and literally just hit Control F check land, and you'll be able to see all 10 check lands really easy. These come into play untapped as long as you have a land that corresponds to what this land wants. For Woodland Cemetery, it wants a swamp or a forest, which is conveniently provided by all of our come into tapped fetchable lands. More reason why these are important and flow really well into these check lands. Then we also have one other thing that needs to be ran in any of these decks. I'm going to be honest, you should be running MDFCs of some kind. For our purposes, we are going to be looking at MDFCs that specifically make up our deck's color combinations. For white, we've got an Ondu Inversion, which is a white land on the backhand side, but also can blow up all non-land permanents for us if we need it to. And for black and green, we've got Revitalizing Repast, a card that can give our commander indestructible if we need it to, and is Golgari mana on the other side. This means that no matter what, we can just drop our MDFCs down, and if we need them to be spells later, cool, we have them in hand. If we don't think we're going to need them anytime soon, drop them down to filter out your mana process. Make sure that you don't miss your land drops while holding these up as spells. They operate as both, so treat them like both. And I did mention that every deck needs to have access to some utility lands, so once again, Pit of Offerings comes in here, and if you are running a deck with black in it, Bajuka Bog also should make a feature play in your deck. It's so easy to disrupt reanimation players by using these lands, so they help us out a ton in any deck we are building. Lastly, I would run 2 to 3 of every single basic land that is available in your colors. This is because they come into play untapped, and a lot of our green ramp, if you're trying to go for green ramp, will specifically benefit off of having lots of basic lands in your deck. And that about concludes it for the mana base you would run while trying to build a 3-color deck. Again, if you're not running Abzan, just take the Murmuring Bosk out of the deck. As for any of the other land bases that you may want to build, all you need to do is substitute the types of lands for what you need. So let's say that I wanted to build a Grixis deck instead of an Abzan deck. So I would look at these check lands and go, well, these don't do what I need to do, but instead I can go over to my lands guide over here, and I can hit Control F check lands, and I can look for the check lands that work in my colors. I know that Drowned Catacomb works in the colors for Grixis. I know Dragon Skull Summit and Sulphur Falls work, and lo and behold, that cost me a grand total of $4 to combine those together to throw them into here. And how much does it cost for these check lands? A little over $4. So you're going to end up spending the same amount of mana either way. Same with any other land type that you have. I can go, oh, I need to change out the pain lands in here, so I'm going to go over to my mana guide, and I'm going to type in pain and find all of the pain lands in the game. And of course, if I'm running Grixis colors, then Mount Doom gives me an access to another pain land that is unique to Rakdos colors. This should make it very easy to make any mana base that you are building, so use that advice for any of the other decks that I'm about to talk about. That said, let's get into 2-color mana bases. This section is going to be split between 2 different kinds of land bases: allied colored land bases and enemy colored land bases. This is because allied colored ones, the colors that are next to each other on the colored pie, have access to more different types of lands than enemy color types do. This is an old design decision Wizards made a long time ago that no longer really fits into the current era of the game. But regardless, let's look at what we have here. Tango lands obviously are unique to our color combination, so with our 37 land mana base and a $16 budget, this takes up 12 cents of our budget. We have black in our colors, so of course we get access to a tainted land, and for 6 of the 10 color combinations in the game, there's a special future sight land that you get access to. Specifically in ally colors, we get access to River of Tears, which gives you blue if you've played a land this turn, or black if you haven't. Red's the other way around, actually. This is 10 cents, and it's included in a lot of basic deck product for a reason. Next, we get access to some other things that are not just specific to being ally colors, like slow lands. Slow lands are wonderful, and with us not having to spend as much of a budget on flip lands or other things, we get access to this in a 2-color combination deck. A reveal land is useful here as well. I don't like using reveal lands in anything above 2-color decks because it's harder to have access to the colors the reveal land cares about. Pain lands, of course, make another appearance here, as well as an Omni land, as it is a free include. With only needing 1 flip land, it's very easy to make use of any of the flip lands. They're all $5 or less. And of course, a filter land makes an appearance here as well. We also have a check land in Drowned Catacomb, just like in the other list. And we have Fetid Pools as one of our searchable lands. Even though we get access to a Tango land, having 2 searchable lands does not hurt us very much, especially with cards like Fetid Pools being a bicycle land, meaning that we can cycle it later in the game if we desperately need that mana. I also suggest if you're running 2 colors, a bounce land would help you a lot as well. I know a lot of people don't like bounce lands because they come into play untapped, but unlike our other lands, bounce lands have wonderful synergy with things like Hagramauling and Fell the Profane, or any of our utility lands. Speaking of which, these are MDFCs. Bounce lands work really well with these because we can drop them down as lands on one side, and then when we find that we need the spell, we can drop a bounce land on the board, bouncing this Fellmire to our hand so that we have access to Fell the Profane as well, so that we can get rid of anything that anybody has on the board. Same with Hagramauling, which is the non-power crept version of Fell the Profane. This gives us more access to removal, and especially if we are running a very budget deck, we need as much access to removal as possible to slow the other players at the table down. Then we have some utility lands you should be running if your deck has black. A Bojuka Bog always works well. Pit of Offerings should probably be ran in almost any deck on a budget that you are running. And for our purposes, if we are running a dual color deck that specifically is Dimir, then a Port of Karfell does a lot of work as well. This is a land that can revive anything out of your graveyard at instant speed. Past that, we're running about 7 swamps and 8 islands, though of course tailor these to whatever your deck specifically needs. And finally, so that we can grab all of those basic lands that we shoved into the deck, let's go ahead and have an Ash Barrens, one of our panoramas, a Myriad Landscape so we have access to Ramp, Promising Vein, and Shire Terrace, making another appearance here as well. And like I said with the Abzan deck, just swap out the cards in each category with the cards that correspond in the lands guide for whatever mana base you are building. But let's say you're using enemy colors. Things are a little bit different there. We're going to do the same thing with having about 8 of each basic. There were 15 in the other deck. There's 16 in this deck. But with enemy colors, we do need to spend a smidge more of a budget getting some non-tapped lands in. For Simic, the one we have access to is Rejuvenating Springs. This card comes into play untapped as long as we have 2 or more opponents and is super good. It just comes down untapped, gives us all the color combination that we need. The only downside of this land is it costs $5 of our budget, but we're using it to make up for what we lack while playing this color combination. We also lack a Tango land in this color combination, so the only fetchable land we will be running is a Tangled Islet, though obviously run more of this if you have plenty of cards like Nature's Lore and Wood Elves that are going to grab these out of your deck for you. Bounce lands make an appearance here as well for the same reasons. They bounce utility lands, they bounce MDFCs, and a check land makes an appearance here again. Once again, we have all of the fetching with a Panorama, Shire Terrace, Myriad Landscape, Ash Barrens. 5 fetching lands giving us access to whatever we need is all here again. Specifically in blue-green, we are actually very lucky that not only can we run the new filter lands, but for 60 cents we can run the old filter lands, though obviously pick whichever lands are going to be within your budget. But for us, Flooded Grove is a nice clean 60 cents. Waterlogged Grove is also a wonderful include. It is a pain land that always acts as a pain land, but we can use it for draw later in the game. I like these lands a lot. I think that there's a lot of people who don't like them because they don't like paying 1 life into them, but that 1 life doesn't really add up that much in most games. And for some color combinations, these have been reprinted into the ground. Again, just check my lands guide if you want to know which ones are which. All you have to do is go over here, type in Horizon, as soon as I can actually learn how to type. There we go. Here are our Horizon lands. So we can see that Waterlogged Grove, Fiery Islet, Horizon Canopy, Sunbaked Canyon, Nurturing Peatland, and Silent Clearing are all options. But Fiery Islet, Horizon Canopy, and Waterlogged Grove are the only ones that seem to be in a very good budget for us. Sunbaked Canyon shoots up to about $5. Of course, you can check the printings to see if there are any cheaper ones, and for this one, it doesn't seem like there really are. So that puts us back over to the other mana base. Whenever you are needing to figure out what you're looking for, again, my lands guide is always available. In Simic colors, we also have access to a flip land, Bark Channel Pathway for a nice round $4. We have an Omni land just like before. We have a utility land in Pit of Offerings just like before. Dreamroot Cascade is another slow land. It's $1.53 in these color combinations. We have a Snarl again, a Pain land again, and some MDFCs. For green, though, we get access to Balagad Recovery, which I think should be ran in every green deck that you are running, even though like $5 of this mana base's budget is going to the Balagad Recovery. But in green, you also get access to Disciple of Freylease, a wonderful draw spell in a pinch, and Hydroelectric Specimen, which can be used to redirect any instant and sorceries that are aimed at your stuff. Just cast it at flash speed, and then suddenly you've got access to a free spell redirect. And that basically does it for dual color mana bases of both enemy and of ally colors. Ally colors will always run you less money because they have access to more tools, and enemy colors will always run you a little more money because you need to spend a little bit more to get the tools that they do have access to. But we still managed to do it for under $20 in both scenarios. But now for the interesting one. What about a monocolored mana base? Now, for a monocolored mana base, our example is going to be a blue deck. Now, you may assume if you're building a monocolored deck that you should just cut the cost and have a ton of basic lands. And technically, that would work for you. But one of the unique things about playing a monocolored deck is you get access to a ton of utility cards. So in blue specifically, if we take an example 37 mana deck with 8 or 14 islands, then we have 8 utility lands that I think work really well. Blighted Cataract draws us cards late in the game. Buried Ruin gives us artifacts that we've lost. Castle Vantress gives us access to Scrying. Cephalid Coliseum gives us looting when we need it. Tocassia's Dig Site gives us a Surveil when we need it. Rivendell gives us a Scry when we need it. Mystic Sanctuary gives us recursion for instants and sorceries. And Hidden Cataract gives us a really cool ability that will allow us to freely cast any card from our deck that's mana value 4 or less, or put it into our hand if we happen to grab something like a counterspell we don't need. In monocolor decks, you always get access to War Room as an easy draw card, and you should be running a maximum amount of interaction cards. Once again, Pit of Offerings makes an appearance here, but you can also add an Ominous Cemetery to exile any creature. Well, not exile it, but put it in their library, which is just as good in most cases. Mystifying Maze can do this to an attacking creature, giving you really good access to Voltron protection. Scavenger Grounds gets rid of everybody's graveyards at a very low cost, and Demolition Field-like cards give you access to blowing up other people's lands if they happen to have a win con attached to a land. Also, if we are running a monocolored deck, we can maximize out on lands that allow us to ramp. Normally, I only stick to Myriad Landscape, but if we are running one color, then you can also run Terrain Generator for $1.28 to grab a basic land from your hand and drop it on the battlefield tapped. Drowned Yard Temple can also put itself on the battlefield tapped so long as it is in the graveyard. Just play a looting effect, throw it in the grave, and then pay 3 mana, and it's basically ramp. Also, if you're running a one-color deck, you can maximize yourself on Scry lands. All these cards like Zalfir and Void that say when they enter the battlefield Scry 1, they don't come into play tapped, they just give you more access to looking through your deck, which is an edge that you need in a monocolor deck when you are otherwise out of options. Monocolor decks generally suffer from not being able to remove certain types of permanents or having certain very easy to avoid game plans like burn, so having access to easy Scry on your lands gives you a bit of an edge over your opponents, especially because unlike temples, these come into play untapped. you also get access to a bunch of really cool tricks here. Like, for our example, I've able to stuff in with a $14 budget a command beacon, which is a $6 land. I normally wouldn't have any reason to put this in a multicolored deck because it costs so much of the price point of any of those decks. But in a monocolored deck, we have access to it now. Super easy. Archway of Innovation also gives us the ability to give a spell improvise, and Sunken Palace gives us the ability to copy a spell on our land. Like, we get access to so much cool shit when we are playing monocolor because we don't need to spend all those slots on fixing our mana. And that's one of the neat things about monocolor that I don't think a lot of people take into consideration, is that you get to run like 20 plus utility lands so that your deck is always doing something interesting. And the thing is, every one of those gains, every time you scry for free, every time you get a draw for free, every time you do one of those things with your lands, you are eking yourself ahead of everybody else, making up for the disadvantages you normally would have in utility that's lost by being a monocolor deck. But with that said, that's basically everything I've got to say about building various mana bases for about $20 or less. You can obviously put more or less money into your decks depending on what budget points you're trying to build with, but I think that a lot of players don't realize just how cheap it is to build a super efficient mana base these days. A lot of people rely on the old staples like temples that come into play tapped that really don't add a ton to our deck for the tapping that we are having to endure when dropping them down. A lot of people rely on the tri-lands without realizing that we've got access to better option these days. I would rather use a landscape in every scenario where I could have used a tri-land just for the sole purpose of it being an untapped land. I have access to it all times, and a draw spell when I need it to, which is the advantage of the original triomes in the first place. That said, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I just wanted to throw this together so that you have access to a bunch of tools and mana bases to build whatever you want at a really, really decent budget. Instead of spending $100 or $200 on your mana base to get a bunch of shocks and fetches, maybe just spend $20 and build these types of mana bases. Your deck's going to feel just about as good in most cases, and only certain decks like Landfall are going to suffer from not having specifically sculpted mana bases to the strategies that those decks are trying to accomplish. That said, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, and as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.